I would like to start with an apology to Leah. Where are you? Oh, back there, yeah. Last night, for those of you who went to her house for dinner, I was supposed to be there at 5:30 p.m., but my flight landed at 6:30. I had a screaming baby, and I think it is my first introduction to motherhood. It's just as I was getting used to learning how to read the time and importance of time in the West, I get a baby, and he tells me, no. Your clock is your clock, but you run on mine. And I do. For the last 2 months, I've been running on my baby's clock. But Leah handled it exceptionally well, and I apologize for messing it up. But I also appreciate your understanding and your nobility in saying, okay, forget about the dinner, stay with him. Thank you. The second thing I want to say is I want to express my appreciation for Vancouver. Last night was my first time. It was raining. I was born in a very dry country where when it rained, we went out and danced. And then I went to live, I do. And then we went to live in the Netherlands, and it rained every day, every freaking day. And I remember calling my mother. This was in 1992, and she asked me, "How is?" And I said, "Mom, it's raining," and she said, "Oh, they're blessed." And I said, "They're blessed too much. It rains every day." And then I came here. So, what do I say about Vancouver? Was I excited about the rain? Would I go out dancing? No. But then this afternoon, I had the opportunity at lunchtime, because lunch was cancelled for some reason, and I got to have lunch with my nanny, and my son slept, actually. And I thought, the food is good. Too good. I had a sip of wine. It was good. Too good. And I thought, my goodness, this reminds me of a place I've been before, and it's California, complete with the homeless people, where people are thin, where the first thing you get is the rain. I was in San Francisco. You get the culture. You appreciate the food. You walk out floating, and then you see all these homeless people, and you think, I have no right to enjoy myself, given that the fact that all these people are homeless. But at my table, I was being warned that Vancouver kind of also attracts homeless people for a number of reasons. This long trajectory brings me to the theme of this evening. The theme is the book, of course, and I was asked to talk about beyond the book, Infidel, where my life is today. I understand that some of you have not read the book. So this puts me, again, in a very difficult situation with time. And I brought my phone on stage, not only to see if everything is okay with my son, but also to make sure that I do not exceed my 35 to 40 minutes. Infidel, the story I tell in that book, is a story, and if I were to capture it in one word, it would be about identity. We live, I feel, in a time when identity has come to matter more than anything else. And for me, I tell my story in that book, my journey, not just the physical. I was born in Somalia, my family moved to Saudi Arabia, then we moved to Ethiopia, then we moved to Kenya. So these are all the geographical movements. And then in 1992, I moved from that world to the West, another geographical move. That's the geography, that's the territory. But it was also a different kind of move. It was a mental move, a mental journey. In 1992, I was 22 years old. I was what you would call an impressionable age. If you've been following things that are going on in the Middle East, the Arab Spring, as it is called now, the cohort, the number of people who are in that age, between 15 years old and say 25 to 30 years old, is huge. It is the largest number. And when you have a youth bulge like that, things move around. And they do, because that is the time when our identities are formed. And it's at that point, when I'm 22 years old, that I get to move from the world of my forefathers, my grandparents, my parents, to a completely new world that existed for me only in books and in images and etc. And I get to really live it. And the first place that I come to is the Netherlands. Why did I move to the Netherlands? I could have come to Canada, which was actually the plan. I was married off to a man from my own clan who lived in Canada, and the idea was that I would come and live here and have children for him, sons. He asked for 6. And I would carry on my life in Canada virtually. But I would live that life according to the values and the customs and the habits that we all knew in Somalia, that my forefathers lived by. My identity, if I had come in 1992 to Canada, would have been probably more Somali than it had been anywhere else. What do? I break with that identity. I betray it. I become an infidel and I move to the Netherlands. My father is angry with me. If I recount the conversations that I had with him, with my mother, with my sister, and just the sheer number of times that the word betrayal was used. I betrayed them for taking the train. I betrayed them for disobeying. I betrayed for taking off the attire that I was brought up to be respectable and adopting a different attire. What did I do? The identity that I was given that was supposed to be permanent, I had questioned that, I had shared that, and I got myself into a lot of trouble. I got them into a lot of trouble. Then I came to the Netherlands. And once there, for the first time, I experienced what it actually meant to be completely and utterly foreign. And my way of solving it was, because we had lived in all these different countries, I will understand this country if I learn the language. So I set about learning the language. And in Dutch, I could go from A to B. I could express myself materially. But that didn't make me Dutch. That didn't change my identity. I moved from village to village. I moved from my home to the school, from school to university. I interpreted and translated for people. And completely unaware of what I was doing, I was learning a new language. I was adopting a new identity. I was acquiring a different way of looking at things. And one of the questions that I asked myself, which was a huge challenge to me beyond, my individual needs to be free and so on, was why in this country that is 6 feet under sea level, that is so densely populated, that is so ungodly, at least on the surface, why is it that we're all streaming here? I was put in an asylum seeker center, and in my asylum seeker center, there were people from Iran, from the Middle East, from every Muslim country that I knew of or had learned about in geography. These countries are vast, and looking at where we come from, we have oceans, and we have mountains, and we have deserts, and we obviously have the last prophet, and we had the perfect book. We were Muslims, most powerful and great. Why on earth then were we coming to this tiny place that is always cold, where it's always raining, you can hardly move around? And that was a puzzling question. It was a dangerous question to ask. And I wanted to know the answer. And the way I wanted to know the answer was in a way that I thought I could find out the answer without causing more betrayals, because I had done all the betrayal, I thought. In 1994, I remember we had a flooding in the Netherlands, and the entire nation on television and in newspapers, they were asking one question, which was, the government did something wrong. That's why we have floods. Where I came from, you had floods because you were bad people and God wanted to flood you for being immoral. And you know, in Holland, they were immoral. There's a red light district. There are drugs. There are prostitutes. Women don't cover. They'd be flooded 1,000,000 times a day. According to the belief system in which I grew up. But they were doing all these things wrong, and they were building dikes and bridges and so on. And so the question of flooding was answered by something that was done wrong by the government. In other words, and the government they have is secular. I'm 24 years old at that point, and I think they're actually, inviting the gods to do something bad to them. Why are they doing this? And the answer was, it is something man-made. It is somebody who was not paying attention to the dikes that were also built by men. And that put me in a cognitive dissonance. It put me in a clash with my own identity. And on the one hand, I wanted to run away from that kind of thing, because it would bring me not only in confrontation with my mother and my father and my clan members, it would actually bring me in confrontation with God himself. But then if they were all confronting God, well, I wasn't going to confront God. I was just going to be, satisfy my curiosity. So I went and started paying attention to how these crazy, tall, blonde Dutch people were doing things. And sure enough, the next time we had a large amount of rain, there was no flooding. And there was no flooding because of the dikes. And the dikes were put in place because of a responsive government. And that responsive government was a democratic elected government. And it was all man-made, and oh my God, how did that happen? And I wanted to study political science to understand also that. And political science was great. I did it between 1995 and 2000. And in those years, it was all academic. I learned all about, the history of Holland, all the different political theories. I learned about how things worked in Canada, multiculturalism, etc. It all made sense. It all added up. It was all great. But that was all in theory, and nothing about that period for me of about 5 to 6 years, 5 years, tested my identity in a dramatic way. Why do I say dramatic? Because I was able to avoid the dissonance. I avoided hanging out with Somalis. Because every time I came across a fellow Somali, the first thing I would be asked is, what's your clan? I didn't want to answer that. Obviously, if I betrayed who my clan was, then they would know the fact that I was behaving badly in their eyes was a smear on my father and my whole clan. So I had an incentive to hide my clan. But also, I didn't want to associate with Somalis because they'd tell me, where's your headscarf? Why are you wearing trousers? They're men's gear, they're not women's gear. They're too tight. You're drinking wine. You have a Dutch boyfriend. I didn't want to answer all of those questions. And I was able to live for about 10 years, say from 1992 to 2001, in a mental idyll where I did what I wanted, I lived like a Dutch woman, and I was able to avoid dissonance at all times. As a translator-interpreter for Somalis, I did get a few hours a day. I did come across Somalis, and I had their problems. But just about every time as they said, who are you? Meaning, what clan do you come from? I would say, this is the end of the conversation, and I'm a professional translator. You're not allowed to ask me these questions. Thank you very much, and I would walk out. And so I kept the consistency within me. And then came 9/11. And for the first time, that is when I was actually thrown off course, where I didn't have to only confront my father about who I wanted to spend the rest of my life with, or my associations and dreams about marriage and having children, or what it meant to be loyal to the clan, but I came in a crushing confrontation with my concept of religion and God and the afterlife. If I had died at that moment and I appeared, I know maybe for Canadians it doesn't mean that much, but when you come from where I come from, the most important thing is the afterlife. It's your confrontation after you die with God. Will you go to heaven or will you go to hell? And that was the first time that I was confronted with it. If I agreed with the men who took airplanes and flew into the Twin Towers in New York, who flew into Washington, part of the Pentagon, if I agreed with what they were doing, then I was fine. I didn't have to answer that question. It was jihad, it was Islam. I understood the vocabulary. In the 1980s, I was a member of a radical Islamic movement that is probably less radical now, but was radical at the time. I agreed with everything that the 9/11 young men did. I could have been one of them if I was a man, and I understood their message. I understood where they were going. If I disagreed with it, I put myself not only, and if I did it openly, yes, I would have problems with my family, but if I disagreed with it internally, I would put myself in confrontation with God. And so suddenly my whole identity, which I was guarding safely, shifted from being this Somali girl who had a clan mentality and who somehow cherished a nostalgic moment when I would go home and belong, and at the same time belong in Holland, to boom, you have to look at yourself in the mirror and answer the question that so many people in Holland were asking me at the time: are you a Muslim? Now that is a very profound question. I wasn't living like one. I was violating all the rules. I had done all these terrible things from the perspective of that question, and yet I was able to get away with it, and I wasn't able to get away with it. So I thought I'm going to look at what Bin Laden had written, what Muhammad Atta, the lead guy, had written, to see if that is in the Quran, in the Hadith. You know, they kept quoting from scripture. It was my scripture, it was my prophet, it was my Quran. And I found it in there. And what did I think of it? I didn't think very positive things about that. What did that mean? And finally I had to confront myself. Well, if I had a choice, I wouldn't choose to be a Muslim. But what would I be then? And that got me into reading about the Enlightenment, into forging my own identity. It was like there was this child, and I was brought up by my parents, and I was loyal to all of these things, but now I had to become who I am, decide what I wanted to be. Fast forward from 2001 to, say, 2012, I am who I want to be. I have made my choice. I have decided that there are different cultures and that there are different religions, and that if human individuals had choices, they would make those choices. I do not say that everybody would make the choice that I made. I have never said and never want to create the impression that all Muslims will become like me. They won't. I mean, think about men. They'll have 4 wives at one time. Why would they want to become like me? Why would they, convert from a culture that allows that to a monogamous culture with all kinds of headaches? So I understand that not every person with a background like mine will make the choice that I made the choice. But what I do appreciate is that as an adult, I did come of age at a time when all this information and all these options are available, and that I got the opportunity, however hard that was. I know it's different from yours, but it was hard, but I at least got the opportunity to make my choices, and I have made my choices. And my choice was classical liberalism, and I'm going to really define that roughly, the right to life, the right to liberty, the right to the pursuit of happiness as an individual, and I mean pursuit of happiness for everyone, both men and women. In that context, I think that that set of beliefs those ideas are far superior to the ideas that my father and mother brought me up with, and that my clan and my tribal kinship represents. That is my view. It's a subjective view. But I've come to adopt it, and it has shaped my life, and it was incredibly satisfying and interesting and exciting and thrilling to live by it in theory. Now, in practice, sometimes it's not as thrilling and exciting. And that is where the intellectual gives way to the mundane and the daily. You have to wake up to the stupid alarm early in the morning. You have to keep time. You have to show up for your work. You have to dress in a certain way. You have to abide by the law. Sometimes the law is ridiculous. The other day we were stopped because we made a right turn on a street where you're not supposed to make a right turn between the hours of 5 p.m. and 7 p.m. Man-made laws can be sillier than divine law, at least if you believe that there's a divinity. So in many ways, the practical life, the day-to-day life, is of course trying and annoying and it's constricting. But it's also challenging. And I think the first time I've come to taste this challenge is after having a child. On the 26th of December 2011, just last year, my son is 9 weeks old. That day, my life changed in a very profound way, because from that day onwards, it just says it's not only about you. And you have now the responsibility to give that infant who is innocent in every way, you have to give him a message. You have to give him a recipe for life. And what is that recipe going to be? The follow-up to Infidel is called Nomad. For those of you who read or know of Nomad. And Nomad is an answer to the question so that people asked me after they read Infidel, which is, how are things between you and your father? How are you enjoying life in America? And then in Infidel, you present all these problems about the position of women and integration of Muslim immigrants into Western society. What are your answers? What are your remedies? That book was easy to write. If this were to become a trilogy, and it was Infidel and Nomad, that would be one thing. But after 2011, after the birth of my son, if I were to imagine, I don't plan to write another memoir, but if I were to imagine a follow-up to those two books, and it would be about motherhood, and it would be about parenting, it would be about identity. What is the identity that I want to give to Thomas Hirsi Ferguson? And just by his name, you can see how diverse and contradictory that identity is. And that's a very difficult question to answer, and to answer Leah's request beyond the book, that is for me now, I think the next, 18 years, that is the big question to answer. And I want to answer that question by saying, ideally, I would like to give him what I would like to have given in the book Nomad. I wrote a letter to my unborn daughter. This is before I had conceived, this is before I knew I was going to have a child, but I wanted a child. And, circumstances, nature, reality plays with you. By having me write a letter to my unborn daughter and then having a son, I'm already put in the uncomfortable position of, well, now I have to rethink everything, and what am I going to say to my son? And what I want to say to my son, and what I would have said to my daughter, is I would not deny you what I think I was denied, which is the opportunity to choose options. So this afternoon, I had the privilege of talking to some of the ladies here, and one of them asked me the exact same question: how would you bring up your son? And the journalists who interviewed me before said, what if your son becomes a Muslim? And what if he becomes a radical Muslim? And of course, that plays through my mind, the what if question. And the answer I can give myself in theory, maybe, I don't know, 15 years from now, I'll go screaming through the house and saying, I'll disown you exactly as my father told me. I'll never talk to you exactly as my father told me. I'll scream and shout and run around in circles as my father did. Maybe I'll do that. But in theory now, what I plan to do is to say, here are all the different religions, here are all the different sources of morality. You take your pick. But I want you to make an informed choice, and I also want you to live with the consequences of your choice. Of course, I hope and I pray, even though I'm an atheist, that he will not become, and I think it'll keep me awake day in, day out. But my plan is to give him that and say, you can have all the choices that you have. But probably harder than that is setting the example. Setting the example always of being well-balanced, always of living by the consequences of your choices, always of trying to be the guide for a child who is growing up in a context. And I come back to the beginning of this talk, but also to the beginning of when I came to the Netherlands, the beginning of our time, in a context where identity, whether it is individual identity, your position in the family, national identity, or even as Samuel Huntington called it, civilizational identity, is incredibly powerful. Everything is driven by that at our time, after the Cold War. If you ask people what is it that drives you, you'll see that it is cultural commonality or cultural differences. And so in that context, I think it's a very, very, very challenging mission to take on the upbringing of children, to say your origins, some of your roots lie in Somalia, some of them lie in Scotland, some of you're a Muslim, you're a Christian, you are everything, and you were born in America, and that is your country, and you have to be loyal to that, and kind of wade yourself through that and make something of it. On the other hand, even though it's daunting, and even though it's frightening, I also think it's exhilarating and exciting. And with that, I invite your questions, and I hope I don't confuse you more than probably the circumstances of all those multiple identities confuse you.